Greetings to a special edition of Rock Talk. I'm the common man, Dan Cole. I'm excited and delighted to talk to Jim Messina, the legendary singer, songwriter, musician, engineer, producer. You've pretty much done it all in your career, Jim. You're kind of a jack of all trades.
Yes, I learned early in life that I needed more than one job if I wanted to have a steady diet, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I get that.
Other than hot dogs and hamburgers.
Yeah, well, for me it was, I think I was living on ramen noodles when I was just getting started in the radio business.
Well, you got the good stuff.
Yeah. You make your home in Nashville now, right?
Yes, I'm in Nashville. We moved here about 8 years ago from California, which was originally my home. Of course, I grew up in Texas, but I realized later that my family, my grandfather and great-great-grandfather were all from Tennessee, and my mother was from Texas, so the people here are familiar to me, their lifestyle and what they like to do, and, you know, it's a lot of families and homes, and perfect for raising kids, so I brought my daughter out here. She was entering middle school, and it was the best thing I ever did.
When from what I understand, you picked up a guitar you were all of 5 years old. You must be pretty good at playing the guitar by now, huh?
Well, I should be. I can't attest to that, but I do say that my dad was a great player, and he had made a guitar. We were very poor, but he made a guitar, electric guitar. I wish I had it to this day because it was really special. And, you know, I'd watch him play it, and I just loved the sounds that he was creating. He could play like Merle Travis and Chet Atkins, and he wore a thumb pick, and I was just enthralled, in fact, so much so that I think that's what inspired me to decide that that's what I wanted to do in my life, and has kept me inspired, you know, to this date.
Well, from what I understand, he was also inspired by Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys, which is near and dear to my heart. I mean, Faded Love and Big Balls and Cowtown, that Western swing sound with the steel guitar and the fiddle, it's great music. Bob Wills was a genius. Oh,
yes. I had that growing up, and of course my dad, you know, he was also into, you know, Lefty Frizzell and you know, a lot of the Spade Cooley and that whole gang of people that were part of that. So yeah, it was in my home and in my heart a lot.
Is that music kind of, was that what you first started playing then? You just kind of replicated what your father did?
Well, I was more of a listener, and I would listen to him sing and play and the music that he did, and of course, you know, I enjoyed it. It wasn't what I played, but I think it's what I assimilated into my body, which later when I moved to Hollywood and started my career as an engineer, some of the first people I met after Mike Giroux and I built a studio for them was James Burton and Joe Osborne, Roger Miller, Dorsey Burnett, you know, Keith Allison, Jerry Allison of the Crickets. I was like 19 years of age, or actually I was younger. I was probably closer to 18 years of age when I first met these guys and started beginning mixing. So I got a chance to see the people who I had play in my household, whether it was Ozzy and Harriet, or whether it was, you know, hearing a Ricky Nelson record. And by that time, James Burton was playing with Elvis Presley. So I was just enthralled to have that opportunity to have that experience. So it made me realize then that that's what I really enjoyed. I think James Burton was probably my greatest influence as a Telecaster player, and so I was very inspired to move in a direction similar to that.
Well, from what I understand, too, you, speaking of guitar work, you were in California, and you realized at a pretty early time that the Glenn Campbells of the world were probably better guitar players. So was that sort of what you thought, you know, maybe I can't pick quite as well as they can, and you just had a feel for the engineering and producing part, or at least you were drawn to that, right?
Well, I went there as a producer at 16. I was working for Ibis Records. Before I'd even, you know, graduated high school, I'd go there on the weekends and work. So by the time I got out of high school, I was thinking I'm going to be a studio musician, and I got a number of dates, and I've played on a number of them. I've played on Jackie Lee, the Duck, which was all black musicians. I was the only white guy. and they loved the way I played. They'd smile as we would work together. I did sessions with Jerry Riopel back in those days, and had a hit record with a group called. They had a record called The Rising Sun. They were called the Deep Six. So I really thought I was going to be somebody special, but after a while I realized that when I got called for a date, these guys were so much better than I was, and they could all great readers, which I did not read music well. So I decided, there's no way I was going to be able to match the quality of these guys, and I decided I didn't want to go back to San Bernardino, back to where I grew up. I just figured I'm going to stay in Hollywood, and I love music, and Mike Duro, who was the engineer when I was producing records for Ibis Records, let me, apprenticed under him, and I eventually got a feel for it, and loved it, and decided that was going to be what I was going to do in life.
I got a couple of names for you. Dave Archuleta, Ron House, Bill Beckman, Jim Scholstad, Larry Cunreef. They were part of your band, your very first band when you were still a teenager, right?
Oh, yeah. I think we made an album called Jim Messina and the Jesters. Excuse me. And we played, through the 11th and 12th grade of high school, probably even 10th, come to think of it. But they were all pals. I met David Archuleta when I first moved to Colton, California, before I started high school. He lived down the street, and he inspired me to get together, and we started picking other musicians. And finally, we had a group called the Boutonnieres, and we played for Shirley Temples at the local Grand Terrace Country Club. And from there, I realized we needed something hipper, so I started calling ourselves the Pendletons, because I had lived at the beach, and I hated the fact that my parents had moved to Colton, California, away from the beach bunnies and more, toward the 4-H girls, which were more into, chickens and ducks and playing volleyball. But I decided we needed to be hip and start playing surf music. So the Pendletons became the name of the band, and from there, those guys, they just sort of started getting more into their, educations and didn't want to play. So I decided to find some more serious players, which ended up being the guys you just mentioned.
You actually did an album, right? It was released in early 1964 through, Audio Fidelity Records, I'm told.
That's what it is. Yeah, it was called Jim Messina and the Jesters, and it was basically an album of surf music.
Because that was what was going. You were in Redondo Beach, right? So that was kind of you were living that lifestyle. You're out on the beach, people are surfing, sort of that.
That's right. Well, before I moved to Colton, I was in the 7th and 8th grade, and of course, 7th and 8th grade, I was at the beach and listening to music. That's where I learned to start listening to groups like the Ventures and the Torquays and the Champs, who did Tequila. Who eventually, by the way, those two guys went on to become Seals and Crofts, which some people don't know, but they were around pretty early in my life and influenced me. So by the time I moved away from Redondo, which was actually Hermosa Beach, I had to do something, and I had to bring that lifestyle to my music eventually, which is why I started the group called the Pendletons. In those days, the surfers wore Pendletons, Levi 501s, Converse or Jack Purcell shoes, or Penny's Towncraft T-shirts. That was the uniform of the surfer. And, of course, I did not want to give that up.
In the 70s, they called them garage bands, right? In the 60s, I don't know if they used the same phrase, but that's basically just bunch of kids that fell in love with music, listening to music. Hey, I want to do that too. And you find guys who think like-minded, and you put together a band. It seems like almost everybody that's in this business started that way.
Well, absolutely. And we always had to, we didn't have rehearsal halls, so we asked our dads, could we use the garage?
Right.
And that's why they're called garage bands.
Yeah. And so then, by the way, we're talking with Jim Messina of Loggins and Messina fame, and now he's playing with your band's called the Roadrunners, right? You'll be in Minneapolis at the Dakota for a couple of nights.
We will. After I moved to Tennessee, I put together a group of musicians who are just exceptional. They're all instrumental, multi-talented. Among us, the five of us, we have guitar, me guitar, and then keyboards, drums, and bass, and then percussionist is also a saxophone player. I should say our saxophone player is also a percussionist. So we got 4 singers in the band, so I'm able to reproduce just about everything I've recorded from the days of Buffalo Springfield to Poco to Loggers and Messina, and of course my solo career. And we only have one horn, but I've been able to arrange the parts so that I get both horn parts, but I'll occasionally throw a horn part on the keyboard player who will, play it on a B3. And I try to keep with the sound of the instruments that we used throughout those times so that the arrangements are as close as they can be to the originals. And then on the songs that I started doing more in the 80s when I became, a solo artist, nowadays we're fortunate enough, instead of using a synthesizer, you can actually take the original tracks, and I have a brilliant keyboard player who went in and took an arrangement off of our Messina album that was horn arrangements, and was able to put the parts on just single notes so that he could play on his keyboard, and they're the actual horns that we recorded. So it's nice for technology to be able to bring in stuff like that. I don't like to play the tracks. I like to just play with the band, let the music move wherever it's going to move, and just really be the musician that I grew up to be. And all my players feel the same way. So I'm blessed to have these guys at this point in my life. They're just super musicians and super fun to be on the road with.
Well, you mentioned keeping the arrangements as close to the original as you possibly can, and I find that when I'll go to a show like Bruce Hornsby, he'll play the hits that he had in the '80s. Terrific piano player. The band was owned that mid '80s for a little bit of time. But when you see him now, he'll change them quite a bit, and I don't know if that's out of boredom, and it's like, okay, I want to have them sound a little bit different, but you try to keep them the way they originally sound.
I worked to do that, and it's funny you mention that, because I used to go to see Kenny do his shows, and I would notice that after a while he would change the arrangements. And to my ear, I do believe they need to stay the same whenever possible. Why? Well, because that's what people first heard them. And I remember one time Kenny and I were getting ready to do a tour, and we were just kind of having some fun. We were looking for the Everly Brothers song called Let It Be Me. And as we're scooting around, we'd find a track, and I'd say, I don't think that's it. And he goes, no, that's not it. I'm sure that's not it. And then we'd try another one. No, that's not it. That's not it. And then all of a sudden, the original one popped up, and he goes, that's it. And I said, yeah, that's it. And we both looked at each other, and in that moment, I didn't want to say anything, but I wanted to tell him that's why we need to do the arrangements the way they originally were, because that's how people remember them. And it may be true. I think, for Kenny, he'd been on the road a lot longer than I had, because I took a break, back in 1976, and he continued to work on his career. And I'm sure after a while, you do want to bring some spontaneity back into the band, into the music, and some people feel that by moving things around that will do it, and perhaps it does, but I think it's important to know what your audience likes, and because that's really what we're there to do, is to please the audience. That's what I'm there to do, and it's something that for me, like I said, when I hear other artists perform their music, and I especially used to love to watch Seals and Crofts back in the early days, because they were so great just with the two of them playing on stage, and the music was so full, and that when I heard their album for the first time in a different way, they were able to capture what they used to do when they were just doing as a duet, and that's why I continue to be fans,
Yeah, well, I saw Boss Skaggs a couple of years back, and he's kind of moved on from that Silk Degrees era. But that's what made him as popular as he was, and he would play a couple of those songs, and he would play them exactly how they were played on the radio. Then he'd play some of the stuff that he liked doing at the time, doing some bluegrass and other types of music, then back to a couple of hits, but the arrangements exactly like you heard them in the radio back in the 70s.
Oh, that's fantastic. I, you know what? I'm glad to hear that. It seems like he would be the type of person that would want to do that. So that sounds great.
Let's move ahead to Buffalo Springfield. How did you end up with Richie and Steven and Neil and all the rest? How'd that come about?
Well, their second album, Buffalo Springfield, again, I was their recording engineer. And after I finished that album, they liked what I did, and then suddenly one day they came and booked studio time again, and they wanted me to be the engineer. So I was in the process of engineering that record when they lost. I was in the process of engineering that record when I got a call from Ahmet Ertegun, who said, I understand you've been working with the boys as an engineer, and I was wondering if you would consider producing them. And I was a little taken back when I heard that because I didn't realize that the guys liked me enough to want to trust me in that way. And I said, well, yeah, of course. And so I became their producer and engineer. And within a very short time, their bass player got busted, I think, for a second time in Hollywood for... I think it was narcotics charges, and they deported him, and they weren't looking for a bass player. Of course, they didn't know at the time that I was even a musician. I never told them that. I didn't feel it was appropriate to, toot my own horn. But I had learned to play bass basically from Joe Osborne because he had a studio he needed to have built, couldn't afford to hire Mike Duro and I volunteered to help Michael if Joe, when he was around, could just spend a few minutes with me now and then and help give me some tips on playing the bass and the kind of amps to use and things to think about when I was in the studio, which he did. So when the time came, I had heard them talking in the studio about needing a new bass player, and so I raised my hand and I said, could I audition? And Neil looked at me and said, you? I said, yeah. I said, I'd like to give it a try. Well, okay, we're going to be, we'll be doing it at 3 o'clock at the old Moulin Rouge building there in Hollywood on Saturday, so, be there. I said, do I have to bring anything? He said, just your bass, we'll have the amps. And so I showed up. But before I did, I needed a bass of my own. And so I went to Bob Ross, who owned Bob Ross Music, and I had worked for him in the past as a dubbing engineer when I first started getting into engineering, and he gave me my first job. And he had a bass there, a P bass. It was a 1958 P bass that he had taken from a client who could not afford to pay their bill. And so I asked him if he was planning on selling it. He said, well, yeah. And he said, but I told Larry Knechtel, the keyboard player, that he could have it. And I said, oh, man. I said, I got this important job coming up. And I did the poor me routine on him, and he looked at me with my sad eyes and said, okay. And so he sold it to me for $150. So with that weekend, I went over, the tunes that I had that they said they were going to do, and I showed up. I was the last person to audition, and Neil, put his hand over his eyes and looked into the dark room and said, "Is there anybody else out there?" I said, "Yeah, me." He goes, "Oh, yeah, Jimmy. Yeah, come on up." So I went up, plugged in. They counted it off. Started playing, and within about 8 bars, Stephen looked back to me and looked at me and goes, "Whoa." I knew all those parts, by heart.
Sure.
And they were so impressed that they said, "Yeah, if you want to be our bass player, you can be the bass player." So now I was producing them, engineering, and now playing bass for them. And at that point in time, I had been an employee of Sunset Sound Recorders, which is where I was working. And I think I might have made, $150 a week or something like that, if that. but I would be getting $350 a week working with the Springfield. So I took that job and said, listen, I'll continue to book time here at Sunset just like we would if you were paying me, but you don't have to pay me anymore. And they said, cool. So it all worked out great.
So with the Springfield, they eventually they went their separate ways, and you and Richie Furay kind of hit it off, right? And then you got the idea to form a band, and that became Poco, correct?
Yeah, while I was producing the Springfield, I never saw them having squabbles, or I didn't know of any issues with them personally. I never saw that, but I could see Neil was drifting away. That last album I did last time around, I only got one song from him that he did on his own and delivered to me, and then, of course, he did on the way home early on when we started doing the album. Stephen was already working with bringing in, the drummers he wanted to work with, and, I would book his time and make sure he had everything that he needed, taking care of him in that way. But Richie didn't write music. He didn't write charts. He didn't have the musicians because the other guys didn't want to record with him. I don't know why. But so through my relationship with Leon Russell, I was able to get some musicians. He had just brought in Carl Weidel and Jimmy Karstein, who went on to have tremendous successful careers. I brought them in, wrote the charts, and we did Richie's tunes. And I think because of that relationship that I had with Richie, which is a little bit more hands-on in terms of what he needed, we got to know each other a lot more. Neil was very private. I never spent any personal time with him, as mainly in the studio. As with Stephen, he had his group of friends and fans that he hung out with. But Richie and I hung out a lot more together. We would go out and have dinner. I'd visit him in his home, and we just became more personally related as friends. And so when the group broke up, I ended up playing bass for Neil Young on his first album, which he never gave me credit on, and so did George Grantham, which he never got credit either. But to Neil's to come to his defense, he did 25 years later mention that he forgot to put me down as a bass player on the album, which better late than never.
Right.
Nonetheless, I had established a much better and closer relationship with Richie, and I wanted to help him, and I wanted to have a band that I was actually an important part of, and that was the perfect opportunity.
Poco, would you kind of call it that kind of Southern California country rock flavor? That's how I've always described it, and I think the sound is just terrific.
Well, it's hard to say. I do know that for me on the inside, when I first went to Richie about the idea of putting together a band, we were still in the Springfield, and I had asked him, "What do you plan on doing?" We knew that the group was breaking up. He said, I just don't know." And I says, "Would you consider doing a band together with you and I?" And he said, I just don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I said, well, if you wanted to, we could put together a group, and instead of doing, a folk rock band, which is what Buffalo Springfield was, we could do something more along the country line, because you've written, Kind Woman and Child's Claim to Fame, and I could hear some of the other tunes he was working. We could, do more of, like, say, a country rock sound, which is where that idea was first coined between Richie and I. And given that I had worked with James Burton and Joe Osborne back in the days when we had built that studio, I had that kind of energy and bug in my ear. And being a guitar player, I wanted to get back to playing my guitar. And he said, well, we'll think about it. And then one day, we're in the studio recording Kind Woman, and we had recorded it in New York, and the guys didn't show up. They didn't come to class that day. Let's put it that way. It was just Richie and I. So Arif Mardin said, I'll get you the best cats in New York, and he did. The problem was the best cats in New York were all jazz musicians. And while they were wonderful players, that just wasn't the vision that I had in mind when I was thinking about cutting Kind Woman. Anyway, we cut it and brought it back to California. I'm sitting in Sunset Sound with Richie. We had asked this young steel player to come out from Colorado who wanted to play steel guitar on the song. And while we were recording it, I'm listening to him do this magnificent solo. It was Rusty Young.
Yeah.
And I just thought to Richie, I said, you remember that conversation we had in the back seat of the car about maybe doing something more like a country rock kind of sound? I said, this may be the guy to make that happen with us. And he said, yeah, that it could be. And I think that's the moment that Poco was actually conceived. But the idea of bringing in Rusty, doing a more country rock sound, it wasn't anything that we were looking at Southern music or California sound. It was simply the music that Richie had already written and wanted to write, and the music that I wanted to play and wanted to create. And that was the synergy and the seed which brought about the idea of doing country rock and the group Poco.
And you know, I think radio play for Poco early on was difficult to come by. And I think I saw a quote from you one time that said it was too country for rock and roll and too rock and roll for country, kind of caught between that rock and a hard place.
Well, that was radio. When we took the music to the radio, when we were on Epic, the promotion guys would show up and they'd say, "Well, you know, we've heard about this band, but you know, I've listened to the music." The program director, and he says, "You know, this is really too country for our rock stations. It just doesn't fit the format." And then we go to the country stations, and they'd say, "You know, this is nice and everything, but it's just a little bit too rock and roll to program on our country stations." So that was the rock and the hard spot that I'm talking about, and it never got better. It was one of the things that made it difficult for the band to continue, because I realized that, and what most people don't realize is that a band is really a business. It's like any other business. You got a product, you got to sell it, and whatever you earn from that has to be able to pay your bills. And the problem with not having any airplay, well, we could pretty much sell out any place that we needed. By the end of the day, end of the year, when it comes times to, you know, pay taxes and see what you've earned, we never really had that much to be able to move forward with. And after a while, you can only sleep in so many motels and pile up in so many station wagons where it gets to be a little bit difficult.
Go ahead.
And that's pretty much what happens with a band. If they can't make it, sometimes they dissolve because of the finances. Now, Poco, you know, even after I left, Rusty, being the road dog that he was, he never let any of those things bother him. He was there for the music. He saw that the fans loved it. He was able to make a living just on what they were able to earn until 1979, when he had this great record hit, Crazy Love, and that really helped to get Poco back, you know, on the road and being able to afford to move forward, and he did a fantastic job at that.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, Rusty Young, he passed away, I think 3 or 4 years ago, and he was the only original Poco member that was there from start to finish until he died, right? He never left the band, correct?
Yes, he was. He became the leader of the band and continued on with the music over the years. I'm just grateful that before he passed, I was touring. You know, it's here in Nashville, and we had 2 or 3 years where we would get the dates booked together, and I would ask if we could do some Poco shows together. And while, you know, I had sold so many more records, you know, the idea was, you know, Jimmy, you should close the show. And I said, no. I said, I want to open up the show for a number of reasons, because my music was more acoustic and moved into an electric band, and it was pretty precise. I mean, I brought my own engineer, and we'd spend 2 or 3 hours getting the sound check. Then I wanted the people to be able to come in and hear the acoustic music and go to the electric, and then have Poco come in. They were really loud. And I remember once working with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, John McLaughlin, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. They had opened up for Poco, and we were the headliners, and they had opened up for Poco. And when we went out there to play, the audience looked like they had been spray gunned with 120 volts of white noise, and they were numb. And I said, volume is okay, but not if you got 2 acts and you're trying to get through the show. So I enjoyed opening up for Poco, and then I would sit in with them and we'd do some shows together. But the great thing about that is that Rusty and I were able to reunite our friendship separately and aside from Poco, the early Poco. And we became friends enough to where he'd come up, spend a weekend here at my house as he was visiting his kids. And I just feel so blessed that I was able to have that time with him. It really resolved a lot in my heart and soul, especially in the early days when you leave a band, it's kind of like leaving a marriage. They really don't want to have nothing to do with you again. But we were able to overcome that and became good friends in the end.
Our guest here on Rock Talk is Jim Messina. So, Jimmy, then you were burned out on the road. It still felt in your heart producing and engineering was what you wanted to do. And then you were able to, did you help blend Paul Cotton into the band? Paul just died about 4 or 5 years ago as well. And I think he wrote Heart of the Night, and he became he became a big part of Poco.
Well, he did. And, I had told the boys that I was leaving. They knew in advance. And part of the deal was I wanted to leave to become a producer full-time, and I had conversations with Clive Davis about that on a trip to Philadelphia on a train ride one time, which was the only time he could meet with me. But during that train ride, he says, I would be willing to consider having you as a producer, independently working here, but he says, you need to be able to leave Poco in good standing, and, you finish the record you're working on and find somebody to replace you, and make sure you leave the band, in good standing, and so that they can move on without having any, issues, and the fans understand that this is something that just needs to evolve. And it was great advice because I asked them, find a guy you want to replace me, and they found Paul. But the band, we weren't making a lot of money, and there was not a lot of time to be able to put into rehearsals. They needed to be able to move right away into the next run after I was gone. So I said, look, just have Paul room with me. So Paul roomed with me, I think, for a couple of weeks. And after a show, I would go over the stuff with him for maybe an hour or so, or sometimes in the morning we'd work on things together. And the great thing is we became friends. So when the time came to make that change over, I was able to do it, give him my blessings, because he was doing me a favor as much as I was doing him and the band a favor. And wonderfully enough, later on in life, that friendship came in very handy, because when my son's mother, Julian, and I had decided that we needed to live separate lives, he would sometimes visit and visit time with my son, and just let me know that he was okay, and so it was a wonderful friendship that evolved, and I was sad to hear him leave this earth.
So you leave Poco, and you're at this point you're thinking, I'm now going to be an engineer and record producer, and this is what I'm going to do. And then suddenly the next thing that happens is, I think it's been described by a lot of people as an accidental partnership with Kenny Loggins. How did that all come about?
Well, I had finally made a deal with CBS as an independent producer, and part of the deal was they would pay me my salary in advance. So I had been paid for the first year in advance, and they were sending me artists, and they sent me Andy Williams, which I just loved Andy Williams, but I just felt that I was much too young to be producing him. He needed somebody who was more familiar with orchestrations, an arranger who used to working with the union in orchestras. So I turned that down. Olivia Newton-John was sent to me, and I met with her. I thought she was lovely and had a lovely voice, but she wanted to be a pop artist. And my experience around pop producers is that, you're really struggling to get the first record to get a hit. But then when you do the next one, you've got to go through every publisher in town to try to find the right song that's going to work, and then you got to make sure the artist loves the song, and they're going to bring you songs that you may not like. And I thought, I'm uncomfortable doing this because in most cases, pop artists really, they last maybe 3 years, 2 years at the most. And Olivia wanted to do, I think was headed to doing acting too, which would be another area that I didn't really know that I could be of any service to her, but I thanked her for coming, and we had a wonderful meeting. The next person was Dan Fogelberg. And Dan, I thought, would be a wonderful artist for me to produce based on the songs that I had heard. But what I like to do when I'm working with anybody, I said, if you want me to work for me and you're going to pay me to do something, how is it that you made that decision that you do want to work with me? Why do you want to work with me? And Dan said, well, that's an easy question to answer. And I said, okay. So he says, well, I want to make a polka record. Well, my jaw fell down, and of course I had looked down to the floor, and I just said, Dan, I spent the last 4 years of my life making polka records, and they were just 2 country for rock and 2 rock for country stations. And I said I never made more than $165 a week. Actually, it was less, $125 a week. And I said, I just can't do that again. I said, if you want to make a record like that, you're going to have to find somebody else. So that was that, and I was already held 5-6 months into my contract, and I still hadn't gotten anybody. And then I got this call that I remembered. I'd gotten this call from Kenny Loggins, and I had told his person who was pitching him to me, Don Ellis, that in summer while I was working on the polka record, I can't listen to anything. He had tapes. I said, I can't hear anything on the road. Let's wait till I finish, and I'll be done around October, November. So I get a call from Kenny, and he comes over, and we meet, we talk. I asked him to play some of the tapes. He said, well, I don't have any tapes. I said, well, how about just pulling out your guitar and singing some tunes? He said, well, I don't own a guitar. Now, I'm thinking my wife is pulling a joke on me because maybe Don Ellis and those folks are... I couldn't believe it. So I said, well, I'll tell you what, I have some guitars here. You want acoustic? Yeah. He said, a nylon? He goes, yeah, I'll take a nylon. So I give him the nylon guitar. I have a tape recorder set up, put on the tapes. I says, you know what to do. I pressed the record button, and he sang Danny's song, Pooh Corner, the Hivala, a song called My Love's Gonna Tumble on You. I think Sail in the Wind was part of that session. So anyway, he left, and my wife said, well, what do you think at the time? And I said, well, I don't know. I said, most of this stuff is folk music, and we've already been through Peter, Paul, and Mary, and the Kingston Trio. Geez, we're into, Dave Mason and Delaney and Bonnie and Leon Russell. I mean, it's a different world out there. I said, I don't know. So I began listening to them again, and I called him back, and I sat with him, and I said, so what do you do for a living? He said, well, I'm a songwriter. And I says, well, what do you write songs on, a piano? And he goes, no, I write on guitar. I have a cheap guitar that I write on, but I write songs. And I said, well, what kind of songs do you write? He says, well, I can write anything the publishing company wants me to write. I says, well, give me an example. He says, well, if they want a Leon Russell song, I can sing like Leon Russell. He starts shaping his voice and started singing some of Leon Russell tunes. I went, whoa, that's impressive. And he said, if they need a James Taylor, and I started singing like James Taylor. Well, I went through Leon Russell and Elton John and James Taylor. And I just thought to myself, if he can sing in these different voices, which means he could sing in different styles and genre of music, if we could do some of his, folk music, and if I could get him some country songs to play, if we could get some really good rock and roll songs, something in gospel, because he loved singing that style too. Perhaps this artist, if we had enough diversity on the album, there'd be enough there for the promotion men to go out into radio and play the different songs and see what does fit for the format. Long story short, that's the choice I made. Kenny was a diamond in the rough. He had never really had a professional band, a lawyer, an agent, a manager, business manager, nothing. So it was about building all of his career, and most importantly, he had no money. So I was able to loan him a lot of the gear that I had been given from Buffalo Springfield when we left, amps. And since he didn't own a guitar, I let him use, my guitar initially, one of my guitars, and helped get his band. Merle Bergani was from the Sunshine Company, and Larry Sims was. So they had opened up for me in Poco, so I called them. Their band was finished. Al Garth lived below me, the sax player. We eventually got John Clark by auditioning, and of course Michael Amardian was a friend of Kenny's, so he was the keyboard player. So I was able to put the band together for him, but since he didn't have any money, I asked my father-in-law, who lived on Mulholland Drive in a beautiful home. He had a big guest house. I said, pool house. I said, would you mind if we rehearsed there? And he said, no, not at all. So I was able to get his music and this band all together and ready to rehearse, but since Kenny really hadn't been a leader of a band, everyone was beginning to look at me and say, well, what are we going to do next, or what's this, or what's that? And I'd given Kenny some of my songs and had been teaching him the tunes, like Listen to a Country Song and Peace of Mind, and I'd written a trilogy. And before long, I found myself working and rehearsing with them and going over the material like I was an arranger, but what was happening is I was starting to actually become a more integral part of what the sound was. And when I recorded the demos and sent them to Clive said, this stuff's really great, but it seems like I hear a lot of you in this. And I said, yeah, I've been involved in the arranging. And I said, to be honest with you, I'm really thinking that it might be a good idea if I were to go out with Kenny on the first tour. But I think we'd have to really call this album Kenny Loggins with Jim Messina Sitting In, because there's so much of me here. There's got to be a reason for that in order to give him the credibility that he's going to need for the second album. Clive was not real fond of that because he doesn't like to see groups break up. But he understood after I explained to him that, there's been a lot of groups in history. Leon Russell, who's gone out with many of his acts, when you look at Stan Getz and Charlie Bird, it didn't hurt them. And he finally said, okay. So the decision was made to call the album Kenny Loggins with Jim Messina Sitting In. And the idea for me there was to simply go out, help him get his crew together, get a band together, go out on the road, play, introduce him to my audiences, which were, Poco and Buffalo Springfield. That would help boost him for visibility. And then I would just get off at the right time and then be there for the production of the second album. But the album was just so successful that Columbia finally came back to both of us and said, would you both consider working together as a duo? Because this is so good and you've got such a head start, and both of you are very, very important. So Kenny and I talked about it, and we decided that, let's give it a try. It's working good.
Yeah, it worked well enough that you ended up writing, performing, producing, I think it was 7 more albums and sold 16 million records in that first 5 years of the 70s. That's a lot of records. I mean, it's hard to match that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think eventually at one point, a few years later, it was up to 20 million that we had finally sold. But yeah, it was good for me. I think it was good for him. I think it was more difficult for him because I think a lot of what he felt as we were entering the career is that how is he going to be able to beat this? Put a lot of pressure on him to have to go out and follow that. But he did a great job. He got some great people together, some great producers. And by then I had helped him to get a good management team, so that was all in place. He now had his agents. He had everything that he needed that he didn't have when we first started to start his solo career in the way that he would choose to do it. And fortunately for him, it was a success.
And then eventually the two of you said, okay, we've done what we've done, and then he moved on to his solo career and you to yours, right?
That's right. Yeah. I actually moved on to some time off.
Yeah, okay.
I was burnt out really after that. I mean, I was burnt out after the Poco thing.
Right.
I was really burnt out after L&M. That was a lot more work, and and the human body can only take so much. I mean, I was never into drugs. I would have a little tequila now and then, but it was the stress of being on the road and living up to agreements and the tour schedules and the travel schedules and just the personalities and the bands, and after a while, all of that can really like a file just rub on your body.
You mentioned Leon Russell a couple of times. A quick story I want to share with you about Leon. He played the Dakota where you're going to be on the 25th and 26th, just a few years before he died. This was 5-6 years ago. And it was such a joy to watch him play. And he came in, ride one of those scooters, because at that time his health was failing, I think, a little bit. So he gets to the end of the show, and he'd come in on a scooter, and he looks at everybody. He says, now, he goes, for those of you who know me, I don't like walking that much anymore. And he goes, this is the part of the show where we get up and leave. You clap till we come back. Let's skip the part where we get up and leave the stage. And the crowd roared with laughter. And then he went into it, and he was just a treat to watch. He was as you know, I mean, you've mentioned him a couple of times, as legendary as anybody in the industry.
Well, I loved Leon Russell. He helped me, as I said, back in the days when I couldn't get the Springfield to come into the studio at the same time, and he pointed me in the right direction for the musicians. And before that, he and I had worked with Jerry Riopelle and produced a song together called Mr. Jasper, which I don't think was ever released. But I got to know him, and I got to realize his brilliance just being around him. It was such an incredible player. It was beyond imagination.
Well, he played in the concert for Bangladesh, and I think he actually stole the show when he did Jumpin' Jack Flash and Youngblood medley. I thought that was the best part of the concert. You know what? And I was not there. I just heard it on the record, of course. But I thought, I know Dylan was he was the feature act, but the headliner. But I just thought Leon was so good that night.
Yeah, he is and was a special person and a special talent that. Not only just Leon Russell, the artist, but before then he played on so many records that were hits for so many artists. It's I can't even begin to count. You have to kind of go to Wikipedia to find that answer out.
How does Jim Messina write a song? Does it just pop in your head? Do you have to sit? Do you sit down and say, "I'm going to write a song"? Does it just come to you? Is it the lyrics first? Is it the music?
Well, it's different in many cases. It can be an image of something. In my mind, it can be a melody that's kind of rolling through my body. It can be a tempo. It can be a subject. It's all comes from different places. It's a question of my psyche has learned how to take that information and run it through a part of itself where it starts to. It's kind of more like a mosaic tile painting or a puzzle where I start putting pieces together. Like in painting, you might say, well, this really should be blue over here. I think I'm going to have some red on this part here, and then, about some green here, and brown. Oh, that looks like it could be a tree. Oh, okay, there's a tree in my painting. And the same thing happens with emotions that become feelings, and those feelings create imagery that create thoughts and pictures that eventually get verbalized or instrumentalized to the verbal state of consciousness. And that's where that all sort of begins to come to place. But it's always different for me. It's a different story, a different picture. a different experience, a different trauma, whether it's a divorce or giving birth to a child. I mean, those are all traumatic. Being born, leaving home, getting married, getting divorces, dealing with death. They all have striking effects on us. And as a writer, I pretty much wait for all of that stuff and all the in-betweens to happen in order to find what it is, the subject that I'm going to write about.
I saw a clip of Ringo Starr a couple of weeks ago. He turned 86. And one of the questions that was asked of him, they said, why do you still tour? He goes, well, it's because it's what I do. He's a musician. He's a songwriter, singer. He's an entertainer. Would you answer the question the same way? People would say, because I think, Jim, you're late 70s, and why are you still playing music? It's because it's who you are, I think, right?
Well, I'm in the process of finishing up a book that I'm co-writing with a really brilliant co-writer. And the answer to that question is in my book. And the answer is it's because it's a way of life and has been for me, as Ringo is saying for him. I mean, I started out at 13 performing, and I have done that. I'm 78 years old, and I've done that all my life. And as you started out, you use the word jack of all trades. Well, I'm an artist of many, many different sources, from playing the guitar to writing songs, to being an engineer, to being a producer, to being a publisher, a performer. All of that is who I am, and all of that is the life that I've chosen to live. And the way I make my money and feed my family is through that art form. And so, again, it's a way of life.
Yeah, and if you're looking for a universal language, I think music is it, right? Everybody who doesn't like music? Regardless of the artist, the style of music, people are drawn to that.
I think music resonates in people's souls in ways that even drugs can't do. I mean, a song can raise an emotion and a feeling that'll make you think about your childhood or your first girlfriend or your parents, a special place that you've been, that you've visited, a place you want to go. It's very much like a book in many ways. People are avid readers. They get a chance to travel when they sit down and open up a book. And I think music gives that freedom to do the same thing, but without having to use your eyes to do it. Your ears really become the conduit that goes core to core to what it is that you are drawn to with that piece of music or that song or that lyric. So yes, it's very important. It's something that when I look back in time and I think about the minstrels, that traveled from town to town, and many of them brought song, but they brought story, and they brought news, and they brought with them what's happening in life separately, aside from what's going on in that town. And I think music does that in many ways, even today. I'm just glad that I was able to find something in my life that inspired me to want to do something other than dig ditches,
right,
that way.
Gotcha there. Let me ask you, at the Dakota on the 25th and the 26th, for those that choose to go to the concert, and I'm sure they will, what will they experience with Jim Messina and the Roadrunners?
Well, what we have right now, I think, for a set is we pretty much start out acoustically. I'll probably do songs like Watching the River Run or House Up a Corner or Danny's Song. I start to move into some of the stuff that I've done in my own career. A song called Mexican Minutes, which I wrote for Brooks and Dunn. We move into some of the stuff there, and Buffalo Springfield, I think we're doing Kind of Woman. We do Listen to a Country Song. You Better Think Twice from Poco. Listen to a Country Song from in Holiday Hotel from Logs, Messina. Mm-hmm. Your Mama Don't Dance. We got some new songs that we do. We end that part of the set. Then we come back and we begin performing some of the Latin stuff from my career with New and Different Way and Loving You Every Minute. We'll move back into Logs Messina, do the trilogy with Jensen, Peace of Mind. We do Angry Eyes. I don't want to tell you too much, but the set builds from acoustic to electric to Latin jazz to the parts where we begin to improvise, and I've got some wonderful musicians, and they always give a great performance, different each night, but always inspired, and I think the audiences love that because a lot of bands don't do that anymore. And in my career, I've learned that, it's nice to not write a nice, tight little ditty that just has all the hooks and hits all the right places, but it's also nice to watch musicians stretch out and improvise and do what they do best. It's a very inspiring moment to watch some of these guys perform.
Please tell me your play, Be Free.
And we're doing Be Free.
Great. It's one of my favorites. Jim, thanks for your time today. I truly appreciate it. It's been a pleasure listening to you throughout your career from the beginning to the end. And I know myself and a lot of other people are looking forward to your appearances at the Dakota. So we'll see you end of the month.
You bet. Thank you. Sorry for all the coughing here.
Don't worry. I'm a talk show host, and I've got allergies this time of year, and I'm clearing my throat constantly as well, so it happens.
Well, that's what's going on with me. I have allergies so bad, and I live in Tennessee, and this year, this is not the place to live if you're a singer, but I hope you can use your razor blade to get a lot of that stuff out of there.
We'll do what we can. Jim, thanks again, and maybe I'll try to say hi to you when you get to the Dakota. So again, thanks again. Please do, and be sure you tell whoever there that you're from the radio station. I'll do that. Did an interview with perfect. Me because a lot of times that's my secret word that I know that somebody's not just trying to jump backstage. Gotcha. I'll do that for you for sure, and tickets are available. Just go to DakotaJazzClub.com. You mentioned Dave Mason, too. When he played there before he passed away, he said he looked up at the sign that said Dakota Jazz Club. He said there will be no jazz played tonight at the Dakota Jazz Club, and then he went into his traffic material and some of the other stuff that he did on his own. So it was a lot of fun. You'll like the club. I think you'll enjoy it. I played there, I think, a couple of times. Okay. But, contrary to what Dave Mason said, there will be jazz played at the Dakota Jazz Club. I can guarantee you that. Very good. Thanks, Jim. We'll see you at the end of the month. All right. Bye-bye.